Before we get into this video, I want to ask you a serious question. After finishing Resident Evil Requiem, did you ever stop for a second and think, okay, where does this actually land in the Resident Evil series? Not during launch night, not during those first few hours when everything still feels new, but later on, after you've had time to think about it. Because whenever a new Resident Evil game releases, the conversation always follows the same pattern. At first everyone is excited, clips are everywhere, people are sharing their early reactions, and for a brief moment it feels like the series might have another all-time classic on its hands. But then the hype fades just a little bit, and that's when the real discussion starts. Because the truth is, Resident Evil is one of those franchises where fans care deeply about where each game ranks. This series has been around for decades now, and depending on who you ask, the best Resident Evil game could be completely different. Some people will always say Resident Evil 2 is the perfect survival horror game. Others think Resident Evil 7 saved the franchise when it desperately needed a reset. And of course there are a lot of fans who still believe the peak of the entire series was Resident Evil 4. And honestly, it's hard to argue with them. Resident Evil 4 wasn't just a great game. It completely changed how third-person action games worked. But now we're in a different era of the series. The franchise has evolved. Capcom has experimented with different gameplay styles, different perspectives, and different approaches to horror, which brings us to Resident Evil Requiem. And now that players have actually spent time with it, that being 5 million players in 5 days, the real question isn't just whether it's good. The real question is how it actually fits into the Resident Evil legacy. To really understand what Requiem is doing, you have to step back and look at the bigger picture of how Resident Evil has evolved over the years. The original games were slow. You moved through environments carefully, managing resources and solving puzzles while constantly feeling vulnerable. The tension came from uncertainty. You never knew what might be waiting in the next room. But eventually the series started to change. And the biggest turning point was Resident Evil 4. When that game was released, it completely redefined how the franchise played. The over-the-shoulder camera, the aggressive enemy encounters, the constant escalation of action. Everything about the game felt faster and a lot more intense. That shift ended up influencing the entire gaming industry. After Resident Evil 4, the series leaned heavily into action with Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6. Those games were fun in their own way, but they also pushed the franchise further away from its survival horror roots, which is why Resident Evil 7 felt like such a dramatic shift when it arrived. Capcom slowed things down again, answering a lot of prayers in the process. They brought back tension. They made players feel vulnerable. And suddenly the series felt scary again. So when Requiem arrived, it had an interesting challenge. How do you take all of those different eras of Resident Evil and turn them into something that still feels fresh? Well, I know just how. You combine both of them. What a great idea, Capcom. Now that I've actually spent a good amount of time with Resident Evil Requiem, there's something important that needs to be cleared up right away. A lot of the early discussion around this game tried to frame it like another traditional single-player Resident Evil experience. And that's really not the best way to think about it. Resident Evil has experimented with co-op gameplay before, and fans who have been around the series long enough probably remember Resident Evil 5, which fully embraced co-op mechanics. That game turned the formula into something much more action-oriented. And while it was incredibly fun with a partner, it also pushed the series farther away from the traditional survival horror that we all once knew and loved. Requiem approaches co-op in a very different way. And not the co-op that you're used to, but a co-op as in two different protagonists. When you're playing as Grace, you feel the tension and the tight horror that you would always feel in the original entries. And when you're playing as Leon, the action never ends. Instead of turning the experience into a pure action shooter, it tries to maintain the tension that defines Resident Evil, while being able to play as two different protagonists. It's something that more closely resembles the original Resident Evil with Jill and Chris, or Resident Evil 0 with Rebecca and Billy. This balance is something that is very difficult to pull off, but Requiem does it extremely well. When two protagonists are working together, the entire dynamic of survival horror can change. One second you have an insane amount of firepower, and the other second you're completely vulnerable and helpless. If the game isn't designed carefully, that can completely destroy the tension. But in Requiem, the developers clearly understood that problem. Enemy encounters are designed to keep both protagonist and the player extremely engaged. There are moments when Leon is dealing with combat up close, and you just know that Grace is in the background providing support from a distance. When a game gets this balance right, it creates some genuinely intense moments. And this is actually where Requiem does something pretty interesting in compared to earlier entries in the series. It takes cooperative structure that games like Resident Evil 5 introduced, and tries to bring it closer to the slower, more methodical tension that defined earlier Resident Evil titles. That approach changes the pacing in ways that might surprise some players, because the pacing in Requiem is actually pretty strong. Encounters build gradually instead of immediately throwing chaos at you. Exploration sections give players time to absorb the environment before the next threat appears, and when the action does kick in, it tends to feel earned rather than random. That balance between quiet tension and sudden danger has always been one of Resident Evil's strongest design principles, and Requiem understands that. Now obviously, the moment you start talking about pacing in a Resident Evil game, comparisons to Resident Evil 4 become unavoidable. That game still represents the gold standard for pacing in the entire franchise. Every section introduced something new. New enemies, new environments, new mechanics. The game constantly kept players guessing. Requiem doesn't try to replicate that formula quite exactly, but instead it feels like the developers were trying to blend different eras of Resident Evil together. The slower tension of the earlier games, and the dynamic combat introduced in Resident Evil 4. Sometimes that combination works extremely well, and sometimes you can feel the game struggling to balance those ideas. But when everything clicks, Requiem delivers moments that feel unmistakably like classic Resident Evil. Moments where you're low on ammo, surrounded by enemies, and suddenly every decision matters. Those are the moments that remind you why this series has survived for so long. So after spending some time with the game, where does Resident Evil Requiem actually rank? If your favorite Resident Evil games are the slower, more atmospheric entries, Requiem might land pretty high on your list. If you prefer the explosive pacing of Resident Evil 4, you might feel like it doesn't quite reach those same heights. But one thing is extremely clear. Resident Evil Requiem understands the identity of the franchise. It respects the past, and it proves that Resident Evil is still capable of evolving without completely losing what made it special in the first place. And honestly, that might be the most impressive thing about the entire series, because after decades of outbreaks, bioweapons, and terrifying monsters, Resident Evil has managed to survive. And if Requiem is any indication of where the franchise is heading next, it looks like it still has plenty of life left in it. But before we wrap this up, there is one more question we should probably answer. If you think that Resident Evil Requiem isn't better than Resident Evil 4, then where exactly does it land within the series? And this is where things can start to get really subjective. The Resident Evil franchise has been around for decades, and over that time the series has gone through several completely different eras. The early games focused heavily on slow, methodical survival horror, with the later entries leaning more into action, and the more recent titles have tried to find a balance between those two identities. So depending on which style of Resident Evil you prefer, your ranking might look completely different from someone else's. Some fans will always believe that Resident Evil 2 represents the perfect version of survival horror. Others think Resident Evil 7 saved the series when it needed it most by bringing the focus back to tension and atmosphere. And then there's the massive group of players who still believe Resident Evil 4 sits comfortably at the top of the entire franchise. So when we talk about where Resident Evil Requiem fits into that lineup, the answer isn't going to be the same for everyone. But if we try to look at the game objectively, one thing becomes pretty clear. Resident Evil Requiem probably belongs somewhere in the upper tier of modern Resident Evil games. It might not completely redefine the series the way Resident Evil 4 once did, but it absolutely delivers the kind of tense, atmospheric experience that fans expect from the franchise. It respects the legacy of the series, it builds on the strengths of the games that came before it, and most importantly, it proves that Resident Evil still understands what makes survival horror so compelling in the first place. That ability to keep evolving while still honoring its roots is one of the reasons why the series has lasted as long as it has. And honestly, that might be the most impressive thing about Resident Evil as a franchise, because very few game series manage to survive for decades without losing their identity. Resident Evil has changed a lot over the years, but at its core the series has always been about the same thing: uncertainty, danger, and the constant feeling that something terrible might be waiting just around the corner. Resident Evil Requiem continues that tradition, and even if it doesn't quite surpass Resident Evil 4, it still proves that the franchise is far from finished, which means the real question going forward isn't whether Requiem is the best game in the series. The real question is what comes next, because if Resident Evil Requiem shows us anything, it's that the series still has plenty of life left in it. For all of you who stayed until the end, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. I'll catch you in the next one.